Be the programs coordinator here at Tibet House, and hi to the people on Zoom. This is being recorded and the recording will be sent out on Monday morning. We're just going to do some quick introductions and then I'll pass it over to the both of you. Let's see. Venerable Gendun has practiced Buddhism for nearly 4 decades and has been a Buddhist monk in the Tibetan tradition for the past 18 years. Until his ordination, he worked in diverse areas such as palliative care, tech refugee organizations, and commercial management. Cindy is a retired marriage family therapist and author of This Fresh Existence, Heart Teaching from Bhikkhuni Dhammananda. Did I say that correctly?
Good, yeah.
Thanks. This book describes the remarkable life of Venerable Dhammananda and shares her gentle wisdom about how to live a more powerful and compassionate life. In 2005, Cindy traveled to Thailand with her family, where she met Bhikkhuni Dhammananda, an encounter that changed her life forever. In 2020, she wrote the award-winning memoir, Finding Venerable Mother, A Daughter's Spiritual Quest to Thailand. Cindy has received novice temporary ordination twice from Bhikkhuni Dhammananda at Sogdamen Kalayani Temple in Nakhon Pathom, Thailand. She hosts the YouTube program Casual Buddhism, a series of conversations with Venerable Dhammananda about spiritual issues and Buddhist practices. She lived in Point Richmond, where she lives in Point Richmond, where she enjoys beautiful views of the San Francisco Bay. If you'd like to learn more about her, please visit her website, www.cindyrasicot.com. Thank you so much again, and thank you both.
Thank you, Venerable Gendun. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight. It's an honor. And I'm really happy to be here at the Tibet House because I got the pleasure of sitting here before the event started, and it is so beautiful. And so it just filled me with peace to sit here in this beautiful setting, and the music was playing. So thank you so much. And a special thank Sorry about that. A special thank you to Shanti Deva Center and everyone who's worked so hard to bring this event here. So I will be doing this PowerPoint presentation, and it tells you a little bit about who Venerable Dhammananda is, because many people just simply don't know who she is. I will talk about how I met her, why she is an important role model for Western and Asian feminists alike, and discuss her practice of engaged spirituality. I'm sharing this, of course, from my perspective as a Western woman who received temporary ordination twice. You can switch to the next slide. Thank you. I should say that, I did meet Venerable in 2005 when my former husband, my son, who was then 13 and is now 32, we moved to Bangkok, Thailand for 3 years. And I did not go to Thailand looking to meet a spiritual teacher. It just happened. And I'll talk a little bit about how it happened in a few minutes. But to say a little bit about the book, just to start off with, it's organized in 3 parts. The first part is about Venerable Dhammananda's path to ordination. The second part is like hands-on teachings. Through the pandemic, I did this program called Casual Buddhism. Well, we felt that people might be lonely and isolated. So we created this program where they could come on and have a 15-minute informal interview with Venerable Dhammananda and ask him a spiritual question, anything that they were struggling with. And out of those talks came her core teachings on forgiveness, compassion, dealing with difficult emotions like anger, loneliness, despair, uncertainty. Anyway, that's what I call the second part of the book. And people who have read it say they come back to it because there are teachings there that are helpful. Her teachings are helpful to them. The third part is called The Light of Our Beings, and it's Venerable's reflections on 20 years having been ordained. And I also talk a little bit about my rather tumultuous second experience receiving temporary ordination. I have a situation where I panicked midway through, which is kind of fun to read about. Anyway, that's in the last part of the book. Next slide, please. So who is Venerable Dhammananda? Venerable Dhammananda is the first fully ordained Theravada Buddhist nun in Thailand. We call her a Bhikkhuni. That's equivalent to a female monk. In Thai, you say Bhikkhuni. She had to go to Sri Lanka to be ordained because it's illegal to receive ordination from a monk in Thailand, still to this day. And there has been a decree since, I think, 1929 that forbids monks from giving ordination to women. So it's important to understand that during Thailand's 700-year history as a nation, they never had a community of fully ordained women. Now, without going into a lot of the history, the Buddha did ordain women in his lifetime. Mahapajapati, of course, was the first woman to be ordained. And so putting this in perspective, I'm jumping forward again into Thailand. At the time Venerable Dhammananda received ordination, there were 300,000 male monks, and she was the lone Theravada nun. When she returned from Sri Lanka from her novice ordination in 2001, she was attacked by the Thai press. She was dubbed the rebel monk. She was criticized by the Thai Orthodox monks, and she faced enormous opposition. This was pretty hard on her. She stopped reading the newspaper for 2 years. And she said, apart from my mother, I was literally standing alone. Next. Okay, so I'm going to kind of briefly go over a little bit the history. The Buddha did ordain women in his lifetime, and shortly before he died, he called for the formation of the fourfold community. Laymen, laywomen, ordained men, male monks or bhikkhus, and fully ordained women or bhikkhunis. Now, how did Venerable Dhammananda know that the Buddha ordained women in his lifetime? She studied Buddhism for 27 years at a major Thai university, and she taught at a major, I'm sorry, that was incorrect. She was a professor of Buddhist studies for 27 years at a major Thai university. She read the original Pali texts in the Tripitaka. The Buddha was revolutionary because he lived in 6th century India, which is the Brahmanical caste system. And at that time, women were considered impure and a hindrance to spiritual growth. So Venerable Dhammananda calls the Buddha the first feminist because he was the first one in world religions to say that women had equal spiritual potential and that they could achieve enlightenment. She's dedicated her life to restoring the, she says that it's like a chair in Thailand. The fourth leg of the chair is missing. So she's dedicated her life to restoring the female Sangha. Oh, there's no picture. The picture isn't there. Oh, it's up there. Oh, it's over there. Sorry, I can't see backwards. Thank you. So Venerable Dhammananda has strong roots in the Dharma. I'm not going to go too much into her mother, but she was kind of an amazing woman. She was ordained in Taiwan in 1971 in the Mahayana tradition. So she was the first modern Bhikkhuni in Thailand. However, because she was ordained in the Mahayana and not the Theravada tradition, the Thai public didn't really recognize her status. And also, there wasn't the internet and there wasn't a big fuss made about her. She founded the temple in Sangdhamma Kalyani in 1956. It was a temple by and for Buddhist women. And so Venerable Dhammananda, actually from the age of about 11, grew up in the temple environment. She received her first ordination when she was 12. So the chanting that she does now when we receive novice ordination, she's memorized. I mean, she learned it very young. So how did she decide to become ordained? she had what she called a personal calling. And so she's such an interesting woman. In about 1999, when Venerable Dhammananda was about 55, she experienced a personal calling. She was at the height of her success in her career and personal life. She'd been married for 3 years with 3 sons. She was a successful TV host of a popular Dharma show, a feminist and environmental activist. She talks about how she wore beautiful jewelry and clothing, and she says she really liked dressing up in outfits, matching outfits, and painting her nails. But then over time, she grew kind of disenchanted, maybe you might say, with the worldly life. And one day she was looking in the mirror at her own reflection, and she heard a voice in English say, "How long do I have to do this?" And that was kind of the, she's an interesting woman because she has a master's in religious studies. She studied Tibetan Buddhism. She studied Christianity. She's very has great respect for the crucified Christ. In fact, there's a Christian cross of the crucified Christ in the library, and people are always, "What is that doing here?" Well, she respects and reveres other traditions. So that's enough about that. Okay. So next slide. So this is a little bit about when she and I first met. And boy, am I younger there. This was about 2005 when we moved to Bangkok. Now, a bit about my background. I came of age in the late 60s in the US. I took after my sister who's here. She was at Berkeley in 64 and I was there in 68 and 69. So it was the burgeoning feminist movement, and women were sort of militant at that point, burning their bras. There was a sense of hostility towards men. So although I majored in women's studies and I received my BA in it, I never really felt comfortable with the level of hostility or anger expressed. And although I saw myself as a feminist, I honestly felt I didn't have a clear feminine role model to follow. So this all changed when we moved to Bangkok in 2005. I signed up for a conference on aid to women in developing countries. And there was this afternoon session called Faith, Feminism, and the Power of Love. So first of all, I'd never heard the word faith and feminism and love in the same sentence. And there was a bit of an argument, not an argument, a heated debate between a couple of panelists. And into that silence stepped Venerable Dhammananda, and she said these words, which I'll never forget. "We cannot solve anything with anger. Anger doesn't get us anywhere. It is much harder to practice loving kindness and compassion. That is the goal of Buddhism." I've said this on many presentations, and I realize I should say that I'm not opposed to anger as such. Sorry, it's a vital emotion. But what I struggled with in my life was kind of stewing and brewing resentment within myself. I often misdirected my anger. I would blow up at people. I just had a hard time dealing with it. And so I guess it was sort of personally meaningful to me when she said that. I thought, here's someone who can teach me something. So next slide. So introducing with that statement about anger, Venerable Dhammananda helped me create a new definition of what it meant to be a feminist. And I didn't have to be angry. I could practice loving kindness and compassion. This was kind of revolutionary for me. And if you practice with Venerable Dhammananda over a period of time, you will discover that at the heart of her message is service. We must be of service and service to the community and reach out to others who are in pain. We must act. And that is her definition of compassion. It is not enough to care, we must act. So she is an activist who practices engaged spirituality. Thich Nhat Hanh, I guess, would call it engaged Buddhism. There was a period, you can go to the next slide. There was a period in her life where she had a turning point. It was 1983. She herself was with a group of militant feminists at Harvard University. There was a conference on women's religion and social change with Diana Eck. she really empathized with this, all the emotional, there's a lot of emotion in the conference, as she called it, the weeping conference. But there was an element of anger, and she said, I empathized with their cause, but I did not want to be angry like them. In Thai culture, we do not confront or humiliate anyone publicly, especially women. It is very difficult in Asian culture for women to speak up, to go against the status quo. But at this point, she realizes she's been an academic for 27 years. She no longer wants to sit in the ivory tower. She has all this knowledge about, and she studied the Vinaya, the Patimokkha. She wants to do something to further the cause of the Bhikkhuni Sangha. So she wants to become more active in the struggle, but she doesn't like the suffering part. When we hold on so much on our shoulders, we suffer. We're not helpful to anyone. I wanted to offer myself to society, but was also concerned about my happiness. That's when she decided to come back to her Buddhist roots, to anchor herself in peaceful thoughts. To confront any issue that is challenging, you must have your spiritual root. It's just like a well you draw from, it never dries up. Buddhism is such a great strength. It really is such a great strength. So I'm going to sort of fast forward here. You can go to the next slide. And it's important to tell her story. And I think Venerable Gendun and I were talking before. There are many male monastics, of course, but there are very few Buddhist feminist religious leaders in the world. And for me, she's like a moral and spiritual compass. When we consider the tremendous popularity of Buddhism in the West, there are many books written by and about male monastics, but so very few by women. And it's vitally important that her voice be heard. Next slide. So basically today, now in Thailand, there are 285 ordained female bhikkhunis. And so she's furthered her goal of establishing the Bhikkhuni Sangha. And the women on the right that you see, I guess it's your left, are receiving temporary ordination. That's what I did in 2014 and 2022. It's simply a process where you go in for 2 weeks. You do take 10 precepts, shave your head, study the Vinaya, study Buddhism and the philosophy and teachings. And you come out after 2 weeks. And what Venerable Dhammananda wanted in Thai society, it's typical for male adolescents to go into the monastery for 3 months before they, let's say in their late teen years. She wanted women to have the same opportunity. So that's why she set up that experience. And some of the women who receive novice ordination do go on to that 285 I mentioned, they do go on to become bhikkhunis. I think I'm going on a little bit long here, so I'm going to sort of wrap it up. I did receive ordination twice. They were very temporary ordination. They were very different experiences. The first one, I was kind of naive and didn't really understand what I was doing. It was really exciting. But the second time, Venerable pulled me aside and said, now, this is your second time, and you need to memorize the chants. You need to know what the meaning is of what you're saying. And so I got a little nervous. And what I realized, because we came at the end of the ceremony, you came to a receiving line of Thais. The Thai people revere their monks and nuns. And it's quite an honor. And I was sort of questioning, who am I? To receive this. So that's when I panicked a little bit. It's like, whoa, this is a lot. But in fact, Venerable Dhammananda said that our main job as ordained nuns is to be humble. And so I got a big dose of humility at that point. I just want to finish by saying the afterword to the book. Venerable Dhammananda said, a society in which women have been suppressed for so long is not easily changed. As Buddhists, it is our responsibility to fight against injustice. We must remove this wall of illusion, this wall of patriarchy. hierarchy and inequity to see the truth of the Buddhist teachings. Whether the oppression is political, social, religious, whatever, we have to think hard about it together, not separately. The extent to which we can think collectively and commit together is the extent to which we can bring about social change. So thank you very much. And I'd like to open up the conversation with you.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's nice to sit with you. I met Bhikkhuni Dhammananda at least online. Zoom is a very connective apparatus. To say a few things in general, I think this is so important, and maybe it starts with take something that you said. When you are ordained, and I practice both in the Tibetan and the Burmese Theravada tradition, that question indeed comes up, like, who am I to receive food? And the answer is no one, because the food is not for you. The food is for your community. It is the Sangha for whom the food is offered. And specifically in Theravada countries, you're not supposed to thank for your food, because the food is not for you. You are a community. And much of this discussion about female ordination evolves around the complexities of what you described as the Vinaya. But I think it is important to listen to the Buddha deeply when we respond to these challenges that we have. Is that the Buddha in these sutras, well, tell the story that the Buddha was questioned a few times by Mara, the Lord of the universe, like why he please would not just move on and stop his attempt to free as many beings as possible from the bonds of suffering and the harm that we do to each other. And then the Buddha highlights every time, my job has not been fulfilled. And then finally, just in the weeks before he passes away, Mara comes again to him like, Lord, it may be time to move on. And he says, yes, you're right. I have succeeded in my mission. And that was the creating the what is called the fourfold community of lay women, lay men, fully ordained monks, and fully ordained nuns. And these four pillars are the pillars that keep the gateway to what the Buddha so beautifully called the deathless open, to freedom. To be mindless, to be forgetful, to be angry, to be desire is as to be dead. And so the promise, the role of our community as lay and monastic participants in that community is to keep this a fortunate era where the Buddha's teachings are present, are accessible to us. But somehow this canopy that we're trying to uphold has been faltering for quite some time with the losing of the female monastic community. Very movingly, when the Buddha is challenged at one point by Ananda, why female ordination is not as happening, is that he had the final argument that convinces him that this is indeed the time, is that we all have been given our lives by women, and that we have all been nourished by women. That doesn't mean to say that the Buddha, in at least my perspective, the Buddha ever doubted that female ordination needed to be happening. He says it actually from the beginning of his mission. But the Buddha was also a realist. He had found something, he had found freedom, but he wanted many to be able to enjoy that freedom. So you need to build a structure that is sustainable. And the Buddha definitely lived in a very complex, half tribal, half sort of imperial systems growing society that was extremely patriarchal. Now women, as in many parts of the world, still only are protected when they are possessed by someone, possessed by their fathers or possessed by their husbands, but free women are game for everyone. And it is clear from our scriptures that nuns suffered a lot, even when the Buddha permitted ordination. So the Buddha needed to find the right time. He needed to have enough basis, enough respect from the local rulers, enough respect from his local society, and a large enough male monastic community to start to build a female monastic community. But the crucial argument, the crucial point that he makes is that women are equally capable of finding enlightenment as men. Although the Buddha therefore created one of the first female organizations run by women, which is also quite impressive. And as a whole, the monastic community is one of the oldest organizations in the world. But more importantly, maybe, it's one of the oldest female organizations in the world because the nuns run their own monasteries. Is that history has not been kind to the female community. No, the first victims of war are women. Some areas in the Buddhist world, monasticism never entered, for example, in Tibet, well, because crossing into the Himalayas was hard, so only some men ever did. But in many other Asian countries, from China, Vietnam, Taiwan at the moment, Sri Lanka, female orders were established. But gradually, where they were established, like in India and major parts of Southeast Asia, over time they disappeared due to the ravages of war in the 11th, 12th century in Sri Lanka. Luckily, it did survive in Chinese Buddhism. And that is important to remember, that it was not that everything was lost at one point. I think in Taiwan at the moment, there's more nuns than there are monks. And so in modern Buddhism, even a monastic community rests for a big part on the efforts of women. And to be honest,
Why do you think that is true, that there's so many more female ordained women in China?
Well, to be honest, when you look in the room, you see the same thing here. That's one of the reasons why I come and sit here, because I find it to become embarrassing that on my side of the platform, 2/3 are men. And on the other side of my platform is always 2/3 women. Why that is, His Holiness sometimes plays, well, he says it in many analogies, but the advantage at one point can also become a major disadvantage. And so patriarchy, also men pay a major price for patriarchy. That given power also disarms you because you never have to develop the strength to uphold it yourself. Now your superior position is simply a given, but that is not necessarily a healthy one. And I see, for example, in Holland, that with the migrant populations, it is especially the women that do academically very well, because they have been fighting all their lives. Their mothers have been fighting, their grandmothers have been fighting, and here all of a sudden they have access to a Dutch university, and here they go. For me, it is personal because, on the one hand, I'm a student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has been persistently pursuing ordination for women. But again, like the Buddha, he has to do with the fact that he's also the leader of an exile community. And so he needed to take time because his goals are manifold. Foremost, his Tibetan people with this rare tradition is very fragile. And so he has taken his time to make sure that this development happens in a wholesome way. But interestingly enough, I was lucky to train with many women. Half of my personal teachers are women. And so tradition in Buddhism is not about institutions. It is about personal relationships. You honor not an institution, that's not the point. You honor the person from whom you got the scriptural understanding and the experiential understanding of the Dharma. And much of my experiential understanding comes from training with women. And one of the women that I trained with actually originally trained in the Theravada tradition. She was a forest nun for a long time. And when her teacher passed away, a male teacher, before he passed away, he sent her to His Holiness. And she says, "Why should I go to a Tibetan teacher? Are there not enough teachers in Burma around?" He says, "No, you should go there." And according to her story, when she went there, then was a time when you could still approach His Holiness. And she told her story and she showed a picture. And she said that His Holiness cried when she showed him the picture of her teacher. And then she said, "Well, I would love to come and study with you because that was the wish of my own teacher." And so he says, yeah, that's fine. You're more than welcome. And he says, but then he said, I have one criterion though. You can study with me, but only when you take full ordination. And he sent her in the end to Taiwan to take full ordination. And so that shows the importance. Both men and women are beneficiaries of full ordination because it heals our community. We were supposed to be the fourfold community that keeps the gates open to freedom.
An interesting anecdote was that Venerable Dhammananda revered His Holiness, and in 1980 she did an environmental study that he commissioned with her, and she was sitting in the waiting room, and she noticed there was a pamphlet on ordaining monks, but nothing about ordaining women. So she said to His Holiness, "Why isn't there a pamphlet about women?" He said, I think he gave a donation, and the next time she went to see him, there was a pamphlet on ordination of women. And that was way back, like in the 80s. So,
Yeah, that's a nice point. Yeah. I think that's also one of the, also from my personal side, I must say, I felt that my own monastic life was fulfilled when finally one of my own female students last year took full ordination.
which one, where? In
I have a Dutch female student that last year in Paris in the Vietnamese tradition took full ordination. Yeah. So I thought now I can relax back in the forest. She can continue the job.
You know, one of the points that you mentioned is so beautiful. I just want to highlight it in receiving the teaching from Venerable Dhammananda is that there was times when I felt she personally transmitted to me energetically. And it's why I wrote the book, because I felt like there was one instance where, and I guess it goes back to your statement that it's all personal relationships. And that's so true. She was so impactful for me. It was actually kind of a funny story because I had written my first book, Finding Venerable Mother, and I was very nervous and wanted to see if she liked it, basically. And she came back and said, well, this isn't not quite right. And this is a little, we call it chanting, not praying. I'm like, okay. But then she got to the heart of the matter. She said, too much I, me, my, mine, too much my venerable mother, my teacher, too much grasping. And of course, I was really hurt. And then a few things ensued. She did a Dharma teaching that night, and I really got inspired because I knew the teaching was for me. And the next day, we met, and she said, obviously I was kind of hurt and thrown it off in the beginning, but I resolved it. And we were sitting there in the monastery, and she said, you know what? I told that story just for you last night, the Dharma teaching. And literally I felt energetic energy coming down, almost a tingling. And I actually saw lines, like black lines. I'm not sure what that was, and I felt, oh, she's transmitting to me and I'm receiving her teaching. And what I understood was I'm supposed to be a catalyst to bring her teaching into the world. And I just wanted to share that because it's just I'm very grateful that I had this relationship with her. And the whole reason I wrote the book certainly is to tell her story and also to promote the idea of women's ordination. But it's also, she just has a tremendous capacity for love and compassion. And I think that's a very important message for our world in these times today. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, especially in the way she does it. I think one to sort of weave two ideas into each other is that both in the Pali Canon and in the Tibetan tradition and in the Mahayana tradition in general, it is clearly stated that our nature is pure. Our true nature is free. We have adventitious problems because we have a cognitive problem. And so from a male perspective, when in a general sense and in a monastic sense, if we look down upon women, that somehow that is an inferior vehicle. And still we are saying that we are not free, because we are saying women have something inherent to the way they exist that is an obstacle. But if you believe that with regard to women, then that becomes equally true with regard to men. If there's a problematic aspect to one part of humanity, that implies that that is also the case for ourselves. That's in general way true. As long as we grasp as something immutable in the other person, it implies also about our own psychology, that some aspects of my own psychology might be equally immutable. We undermine the belief in the attainment of nirvana when we say that half of humanity might not be able to achieve it. And I think what Bhikkhuni Dhammananda does very importantly is to highlight that the freedom of one half of humanity must also imply the other half. And one thing that she does very well is not to, as Jennifer earlier said, she highlights very importantly that this is not a zero-sum game. That to create a place for women where they can flourish again, and it is happening. There is monasteries now in Sri Lanka, in Thailand. There's now fully ordained nuns in Bhutan. In the Gelu traditions, women can now do the full Geshe studies. Many great teachers specifically in Taiwan, academically very accomplished. One of some of the great scholars of the 21st century are women. So it is growing. But by doing so, these women that work so hard also make the men believe that it is truly possible. To heal the one is to heal the other. We cannot be separated. And I think in a time in a world that is becoming so polarized, now you are facing your elections. And these elections have so much become a zero-sum game. That's everywhere. That I look across a few borders in Ukraine where it seems to be the same way. And the winning of the one must be the losing of the other. But that simply creates an ever-perpetuating continuity of harm. And what Bhikkhuni Dhammananda nicely does in her gentleness is to bring about transformation. And when I spoke to her, what I found very impressive is that I asked if there are any monks that are interested in supporting her community. And the interesting thing is that actually young monks, so newly trained monks, actually are more than happy to come to her monastery and to assist in the teaching and the training of women. And so you see that her gentle resistance, that her persistence brings about great change. And that change is as effective for the women, as important for the women as it is finally for the men.
She's very, that's beautifully stated. Thank you. She's very respectful of male monks, and she will bow to them down on the ground. And her belief is, there's a chapter on forgiveness in the book, is that when we forgive others, we're healing ourselves, which alludes to what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it is an important lesson that there are ways of resistance that are healing for all parties. Yeah. And we live in a world that is tending to forget that, where we incline towards self-righteousness instead of being righteous. And instead of pursuing justice, we pursue being right. And even if theoretically we're right, but we pursue it in a self-righteous way, we do far more harm, because you inevitably invite a counter-response. Bhikkhuni Dhammananda doesn't invite a counter-response. There's nothing to respond to. She just very happily and gently does her thing, and it grows. And so there's nothing to complain about.
Right. Yeah, she's kind of remarkable that way. She says, I'm a Buddhist first and a feminist second. And I said, well, what does that mean? Well, in terms of the controversy and the attacks, personal attacks, she said, I do not judge the person. I'm not angry at the person as an individual. I view it as their ignorance. She goes back to the teaching of the Buddha. And she really doesn't, just like what you were saying.
And so I think, in a context of Buddhism, we can talk about the great goals, and the great goals are exceedingly important. I think it is a recurrent topic in our history that we lose belief that actually enlightenment is a feasible thing. And so to keep emphasizing that it is an achievable goal in this life and maybe the next one remains important, but it should never be divorced from the social implications. And when I look at Buddhist history, at the evolutions that Buddhist history went through, instead of taking them in a doctrinal sense, I'm very much interested in what these different movements as the Mahayana and the Tantric tradition also are in terms of criticism of where the Buddhist tradition is moving towards. And a very important aspect of Tantric Buddhism, for example, is the role of the feminine. And so we can talk about, well, the doctrinal differences, but I'm very much interested in the fact that Buddhist communities in their different stages of development had an internal criticism. But it said, well, what we are doing to women, that we make them into second-class citizens, makes our own Dharma unbelievable. And so they must be brought back to the center, because otherwise we lose the whole thing in its entirety. It's like driving a car and thinking like, well, my left side wheels are more important than my right side wheels. And so you only replenish the left ones, but you leave the right ones to sort of to disintegrate. And at one point you will have an accident and your car will turn upside down. And I think that is the great risk of the whole lay and monastic community as a total, as vehicles of the Buddha Dharma, to keep that experience and that understanding that is so important in this world, will be very hampered if we're not whole, if we don't have four wheels.
I'm just curious if there's any questions at this point from your perspective.
Thank you so much. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the incorporation of the Tibetan tradition into Bhikkhuni Dhammananda's practice. There was a brief image of the medicine Buddha
Oh yeah, could we
there.
bring that back up? Thank you. Thank you. Oh, well, it'll come. So basically, in 7 years before she was decided to be ordained, Venerable Dhammananda was sitting in a meditation, and she had a beautiful vision of a medicine Buddha. And I think, if I remember correctly, people could enter through a flap door in its knee and kind of travel through its body. And she saw a specific image of this Buddha. And for years later, she went to Sri Lanka, Myanmar. She was looking for this particular image that she saw. She never found it. So Bhikkhuni Dhammananda is also an artist. And yeah, that's the blue. I love the medicine Buddha. It's in a vihara that was dedicated in 2008. And my personal story is that I had a pretty serious back injury, and I prayed to the medicine Buddha every day. So I have revered just being in the presence of that blue Buddha. My meditations are deeper, more profound. But back to her story. So she said, well, I can't find the image anywhere, so I'll draw it. And then she had a sculptor in Thailand, an artist, make I think it's called a wax figure or what? I'm not an artist, sorry. Anyway, did the basic wax model of it. And then she had this made, and every full moon we go in, and we chant the medicine Buddha Vihara, the chant. And we say it, we used to say it 108 times, and boy, I got lost in that. It would go back and forth and back and forth. It was very fast. Now we do it about 30 times. And then she comes and there's many rituals. And she takes water and they look like straw or sticks, and she blesses the water and then sprays it all over everyone. And it's just magical. And afterwards, she puts us in a circle and she has us tell something significant about our day. And I love this because it's a way that the community binds together. And Venerable is very focused on the community and the larger community. She has programs. She developed a program in the prison for women prisoners on meditation. When she was younger, she had a home for unwed mothers. And one of the young girls that grew up there is actually still there and helps her. She's her assistant. She has an eco temple, so she's very focused on environmental issues. I'm getting a little away from the Tibetan here, but she's just interesting in that perhaps it's her nature, but she studied Chinese when she was a graduate student. She studied Christianity. She studied Tibetan Buddhism, and she reveres the medicine Buddha. I've never talked about this actually. I saw the word mystic on the wall here. It was in context, and in Theravada, I don't hear them talk about mysticism too much. But one night, it was the full moon, and Venerable had the sticks, and they were on fire. And she literally put them in her mouth when they were on fire, quench the flames, lit them again, and she looked like she was in a different space. I'd never seen her like that. Well, I asked her afterwards, and she said, well, the healing entity that came to me, the healing being, said, I needed to do this for the betterment of the Sangha. So it's just interesting to me. There's a lot of something called animism in Thailand, and I'm afraid I'm not an expert in it, but it's spirits in the land and the trees, etc. So she herself, and perhaps, I don't know, you could speak more to this than me, but the Theravada, the Thai Theravada, there is definitely a sense of that the spiritual and the mystical. And I definitely experienced that with the Tibetan medicine Buddha. Thank you for that question.
Actually, her son is a pretty good artist, because when I spoke to her, it was interesting enough a tanka of Tara hanging behind her head, which had been painted by her son, which was a very nice detail. Yeah, for one thing.
Yeah. I think she has a green Tara and a white Tara in her monastery.
And I think that is also another important point that I think that is to be taken into consideration. I think as Buddhist communities, we have two challenges. And that is patriarchy, or the equality between men and women, is also sectarianism. I practiced in both Theravada and Tibetan tradition, and initially when I entered the Tibetan monastery, I was Hinayana, and with all the disadvantages that come from that label. And when I went to a Theravada community, I was Mahayana with all the disadvantages of that label. Because we are all sons and daughters of the Buddha, and our communities are complementary. No, when you get old enough and you have siblings, and your sibling is here, so we can later test that. But I don't know about you, but sometimes when I talk to my own sibling, it seems, if you would interview both of us separately, it would be difficult to gather that we have the same parents. Yeah. So over time, our understanding of that past is filled with the meaning of our lives and our experiences and so on and so forth. And I always wonder why we believe that should be different within Buddhism. We are 2,500 years down the road. And that means, we say institutions and we think about something abstract, but this is men and women. Thousands upon thousands of men and women that have studied and went into the wild and meditated and passed on their experiences. And of course, every single step in that process imbues the tradition with something new. To keep the teachings alive, you must always retell them. You tell them according to your own personal experiences. So every individual highlights one thing and another individual highlights something else. And of course, over time, as Buddhism spread to Asia, it obtained many different forms. The essence stayed the same. We are empty of inherent existence, and we can be free, and we walk the Eightfold Path. That would be a pretty concise description of Buddhism in a very tiny nutshell. But the form, the richness in forms that we obtained is can also is to some extent can become a trap, because we are as human beings inclined to hold on to the vehicle rather than the content of the vehicle. And especially as 21st century individuals, as Bhikkhuni Dhammananda is, but also as here as, well, I was about to say New Yorkers, but I'm not a New Yorker, as you can hear from my thick accent. But one of the things that I always enjoyed about the West is that all the sons and daughters of the Buddha are coming here back together. Now I have been a resident teacher in Amsterdam. You can take a bicycle, as Amsterdam people will do. And within an hour, you can see every single tradition that ever came forth from the Buddha's mouth. So you can cycle to, well, around my corner is the Tibetan Buddhist temple, where then I teach from time to time. Now, within a half an hour, you're in a Burmese temple or another Tibetan tradition. There's a number of Chan and Zen temples. And so we are coming back together. And I think it is very important to appreciate that richness also, because we are mirrors to each other. And all of these traditions emphasize something. And what they emphasize is of importance. And so to be enriched by the other tradition is very healthy. Theravada guarded, like, for example, the ancient lifestyle. When I was in Burma, the fact that you can still go into a forest as the Buddha did and live on a begging bowl as a storeroom. No, that is, I don't think I want to try that in New York. I don't think this would be a very productive thing to do. Yeah. And at the same time, and that is not lacking in Theravada, but one of the things that the Tibetan tradition, for example, exemplifies is that the Buddha came here for all living beings, and that our task is to pursue what he pursued and what his community pursued. And so all these, when you bring all these traditions together, they show the richness of what the Buddha had to offer, all in their own way, in their own forms, their own colors, imbued by the stories of thousands upon thousands of men and women that bring it to this day, because they are the institution. And so it's very nice to see. I was quite surprised, actually, the first time I saw that. The medicine Buddha with a Thai description underneath, but very impressive. Yeah. By the way, you can also see it actually the opposite in Dharamsala. The Namgyal Monastery in Dharamsala, behind which His Holiness lives, we have the fortnightly confession ceremony. And His Holiness always makes sure to send his own monks and nuns into the surrounding area to find any monks or nuns from other traditions, to make sure that they know that they can participate. That is not a sectarian thing, but the monastic community in the end is, the wholeness of that community is important. The Buddha said one of the worst things that we could do is to separate that community. And somehow it happened a little bit. And I think, it would be nice to glue these rifts back together. Yeah, make a quilt back together. Yeah, it's okay to have some differences, but we still pursue that one thing that's the benefit of all living beings. And so that's to see that represented, on the one hand in Bhikkhuni Dhammananda's temple, but also to see that represented in my visits to Dharamsala is heartwarming, and it gives a vision of the future where these traditions are mutually enriching rather than deprecating each other. That was a long answer to your question. Maybe there's more questions. Is there a question online? But it's quite interesting that one of the things that I enjoyed in your book actually is that story that Bhikkhuni Dhammananda is living in the temple of her own mother.
Yes.
So the first intrepid generation was mom.
Yes.
It must have been also been quite something to live in the monastery of your mother, who was the head nun.
She was kind of formidable. She was a jujitsu sword fighter. In 1932, she rode her bicycle from Bangkok to Singapore with the Boy Scouts. She wrote feminist novels. Venerable called her the lawgiver, and she was quite strict with her. So in her way, I think Venerable, until she got ordained, she had a bit of an inferiority complex, and she had a hard time with her mother. She went through a period in her 40s where she began to, there's actually an interesting story. I think it was at that conference in Harvard. A woman got up and talked, or maybe a different conference, but a woman got up and talked about how her father had beaten her as a child, and how towards the end, and he left the family, and the mother raised her as a single mother, and her sister, and she went on to get a PhD and studied psychology. And this woman, who we'll call Mary, got up and told her story. Apparently, at the end of his life, her father asked I believe he asked her to come take care of him. He had cancer and he was dying. And at one point, he said to the nurse, "Don't give me the injection," because it was making him sleepy. He wanted to say, he mouthed the words to his daughter, "I love you." And the daughter was able to forgive him at that point. And for some reason, that story was so powerful to Venerable Dhammananda. She realized that her mother was one of 6, I think there was like 6 women, girls in her family, and her mother's father always wanted to have a boy. So she never felt her mother never felt accepted, never felt loved. And so at that point, Venerable Dhammananda said she started hugging her mother. And she said she said she didn't like it, but she thinks she really did like it. Because she realized that if you expect love, if you want to give love, then you need to be able, if you want to receive love, you need to be able to give love. And she was able to see her mother's life a little bit more in perspective. And probably from about the age of 45 on, she really became very close to her mother. And, you know, I've been talking to her weekly now, and I asked her a question as she's aging. Is she thinking about her parents and what context? And she said, you know, my mother achieved, she has high punya.
Spiritual virtue.
Spiritual virtue, thank you. So she doesn't think too much about her. In other words, she's doing pretty well. But her father was paralyzed in the last part of his life. And she felt bad because at that time she was newly ordained and she didn't have the time to spend with him. I do believe he came and lived in a kuti, a little hut on the temple on her property. But she just felt bad that she couldn't devote the time and the love and the attention that she wanted to her father. And I thought that's really interesting. But her mother was clearly her role model for the monastic life and for change. And her father was the role model for social responsibility. And really, apparently, he really had a great heart and wanted to help people. He was a politician. He served people in the South. He was on the opposition side to the military, I believe, the Democratic Party. He was jailed several times. So he was a teacher. He taught her about righteousness. Anyway, I got a little segue there, but I just thought that was sort of interesting.
Yeah. That's a nice point. I think there's another side point that maybe at the moment is good to make. The question is often, why don't monks just change the rules? Yeah. And it's not as simple as that. You can imagine that this is a 2,500-year-old organization that survives because of the care with which we held the way the Buddha created this organization. It is also a 2,500-year-old organization. It was built for another time. Teachers, whatever you do, you always are embedded in the place where you create what you create. The way the Buddha voices things, the way the Buddha created the monastic community is thoroughly, is a beautiful relic of that era, and it's still very precious. As we saw before, it was difficult for the Buddha to create a female community. He was afraid for the well-being of the nuns, and that was a major problem in his life. And he was very worried about the future of his community, that it would be so profoundly criticized by a patriarchal society that you would put women in that dangerous position. And for example, you see that he was inclined to give ordination because he allowed his foster mother very early on to wear robes like a monastic, but he asked her to please stay home. Don't go into the forest, it's way too dangerous. In the end, the women show that they can do that. So they walk for hundreds of miles after the Buddha on bare feet, end up at the front gate of his monastery, sort of like, come on, it's the time, which is a beautiful symbolic moment of indeed. So now the community is robust enough, the women are robust enough, because the problem is also that the patriarchy is profoundly disempowering. I always look at my own mother. My mother was born in the 40s. Now you might want to be free, but freedom means also that you have the inner resources to pursue it. And we're not isolated beings. And so my mother was never entirely free to get what she aimed for. She was a part of her era. And in a way, that is a beautiful way of looking at what happened with these women. Like the Buddha created the space, but they also needed to own it. Right? The women needed to take that power. Like now is the time, we want it. And then finally Buddha says, okay, then here you have it. That was a complex moment. And there is some unclarity about what exactly happened there. That's the piece of scripture in which it's described leads to some vagueness. As modernists, we can have all kinds of questions about how to deal with this. But I think it is important to understand the sense of wanting to keep the integrity of our monastic community. Because the Buddha stated very clearly that of all the disastrous things that we might do, the most disastrous things of all is to separate the community, to break the community. And so we might, as well as modernists, we feel often urges. We feel an urgency to sort of run forward and to make that change happen today. But the big risk is that you rupture an entire community over differing opinions. And what both His Holiness and Bhikkhuni Dhammananda, in that sense, symbolize the Buddha is to have the infinite compassion and patience to take the long road, to make change happen, but in such a way that it does not fracture the community, that you in the end bring everyone to the other side. And so I think it is very important to see in ourselves that as Westerners, we have that sense of, we immediately want to go and fight in the street and resist and make change immediately happen. But if we look around us, we see equally also in our own societies that it is often not so sustainable. If we want to make fundamental change, then we must bring everyone along. And
That's really important. Thank you.
yeah. Because the will is there. There's just hesitation. So obviously there are always individuals that have not such noble reasons. But I think equally it's very important to see that there's many that have very noble reasons. But for the monastic community, the wholeness of the community is central. And it is for Bhikkhuni Dhammananda, because in my talk to her, that is the one thing that she brought to the fore again and again, that she said that she is doing what she's doing for the wholeness of the community. And that is actually where we started. And that when you become a monastic, it is not about you. It is about a place where all living beings, or in this case, all humans can find a home to pursue freedom. And so I'm most pleased that she opened the door to women again. And that there's now gradually a burgeoning female monastic community. And that more and more men are inclined and empowered by what she does. It will take time, but good things must take time. Yeah. And to be impatient is also to be unkind, because you force the other person to what he or she can't do. Yeah. And it's wonderful to see an example of a differing perspective on social change, because I think that is what we need. We are entering a very difficult era in our own time. We need a long breath, a very long one. Yeah. Because otherwise we quickly become exhausted in our sense of being incapable and so on and so forth. Yeah. And then she's a good example of what happens when you just persist for 40 years.
She also has a really good sense of humor. And
That's
she
also
will,
very helpful.
yeah, she will talk about the importance of humor. I see another question.
I'm a secularist, but for over 2,000 years, we've been philosophers, religious, have discussed the role of disruptive change and the role of social change. This is nothing new. I want to get back to your point about anger, because we know through patriarchies historically, there is a fundamental anger and desire for maintaining the authority and the social order. Are you saying that, and we're of the same era in feminism,
Right.
I would say my anger served me well in the 60s and 70s in terms of disruptive change. Where are you on, yes, we could have waited forever to get, the right to vote, or now the right to dictate what happens to our bodies. Are you saying that there is in Buddhism never a place for the disruptive sociological change?
No, there's a lot of space for being disruptive. But
Being what?
to be disruptive, but to be
Very-
disruptive, you need to be able to sustain it.
Say that again, please.
To be disruptive, you need to be able to sustain it.
Yes.
Because the 1960s also had many hopes that never materialized, or that are still need to be materialized.
Yeah, I mean, we are debating this for centuries, and certainly for the last century. So I'm just saying, is there any role for disruption and anger or not?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And that's why I was trying to just say, I mean, anger has its place. And I mean, Venerable Dhammananda would say the Buddha was revolutionary because he took a stance that men and women had equal spiritual potential. And she's very much, and she calls herself a warrior. So it's not so much, I guess, that the anger isn't there and it's a vital source of energy. And she leans towards righteousness. And I'm not sure how those two, maybe, I don't know, maybe, what am I trying to say here? I think anger has its place, and yet what I see so many times is that it's misdirected and used in a hostile or an attack form. And I think what we're talking about is the understanding that you're on the path of righteousness. You have the right to protest, but you don't have the right to harm another human being. Does that make sense? What is your question? It's a good question.
To this question, I mean, I studied theology, in my early years, and
Mm,
come from a tradition of purely patriarchal.
mhm.
I'm not talking about anger that is abusive or anger that
Right,
diminishes somebody, that's not what I'm talking about.
okay.
But at the individual level, the spiritual level, one can experience things that we know are wrong, that make us angry. And look, I was a young scientist in the 70s with all male scientists
Right.
at a prestigious university. They made it impossible for the two of us that were in the graduating class. If it wasn't for our disruptiveness, that led others to see that we were allowed to be disruptive. I could have waited until the cows came home to get a PhD. So I guess I just want to know, because I'm not a Buddhist, I'm trying to understand Buddhism better. I just thought it earlier in the talk, you were saying that you personally didn't like the angry part of feminism. I just want to make sure I'm not overgeneralizing it, and that we're saying that female monks and nuns, it's frowned upon for them to feel impatient and angry with the system, because I find that pretty superhuman.
I think that Venerable Dhammananda, if she were here, would say she gets angry, she gets impatient. There's no question. And the word you used is disruptive. Actually, what you did was very courageous. You stepped forward and took your place, your rightful place. So is that disruptive, or is that just taking what is yours? It was disruptive. Okay.
That women have done in the last 50 years are conscious.
Right.
The maintaining a disruption really confounds my question, because you have to be appropriate in your actions at any time. Individuals change and society changes. So maintaining a level of disruption just to be internally consistent with oneself doesn't sound like anything that would interest.
Right. Right.
Maybe it is helpful in this context to realize that some words we use relatively underdefined in Western language. In Buddhism, anger is pretty narrowly defined as the inclination to harm someone back. And so we might be talking past each other. Yeah. And so disruptive action, of course, is very important. And when you look out through Buddhist history, in many moments, the Buddhist community as a whole did pretty abrupt things. And so here, this definitely plays a role. That's why I'm sitting here, for one thing. But at the same time, at the moment, for example, I'm reading a biography of Martin Luther King, who was also extremely disruptive. But with Martin Luther King, I think exemplifies in the same sense that he realized that the challenges of African Americans was closely interlinked also with poverty of white farmers, for example. Yeah, the one of yeah. Yes. And so I think that is exactly what I wanted to highlight, so that it is that you can be disruptive. But from a Buddhist perspective, you don't use anger, because anger is a zero-sum game. I shall win at your cost. So I will get what I want and I will take it from you. And the Buddha would argue that is a losing game. You might win in the short term, but the other person will try to get it back because you disempower the other. And so here the thing that she's doing, and that is what I find really impressive, is that in my conversation with her, she showed that she empowers actually young male monastics. They love to come to her temple and teach Buddhism. Also, you have young academic monastics coming to her temple, and they feel empowered by being able to participate in the growing of a female community. So she gets it both ways, because she understands that it is not a zero-sum game. And of course, what she initially did is to go to another country, take ordination there, and come back knowing that you are being seen is pretty disruptive. I mean,
it was disruptive.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question.
But you can't be disruptive in the sense that you harm others. And for that, you need a long, patient breath to know. And I think that is exactly the point that you make, because the challenge that women have in us, even in our own society, is far from solved yet. And when I hear that 1/3 of the women in Holland still experience sexual violence and abuse. And I think, wow, that, we are eager to look at other countries, but I think, well, we should maybe look first at our own home. That fight is not finished yet, and we need a very long breath. And so to be able to be disruptive over time is also to know when to do that, when it matters and when it doesn't, and to be able to pursue that ideal over decades and not become fatigued by it. And that's the important point that the Buddha also makes, that anger and had all unskillful emotions are exhausting in the end. As we all know, when you get really angry and when the mind turns to an abusive state, this is exhausting. You can't sleep at night. Your cognitive factors are hampered.
Yes. I really appreciate your question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shruti Patel asks, does this mean that some individual monks believe that only men have the seed/potential of becoming a Buddha?
This idea has existed. And this idea is specifically defeated by Lord Buddha himself. It is as simple as that. The Buddha was unequivocal. Men and women have exactly the same capacity to become enlightened. The problem that came into the world, and that is when we look uncontextually to some of the Buddhist texts, we don't realize what some of the scholars are saying. That in some phases in India, to be a woman was highly disadvantageous. So from the perspective of a tradition where you reincarnate, so where your spiritual trajectory lasts over different lifetimes. Now, at the moment, I'm not praying to be reborn in Afghanistan. That doesn't mean that I discriminate against Afghanis. I know I've fantastic, beautiful culture. But, at the end of my life, I will not like, oh, Lord Buddha, let me be reborn in Afghanistan. Well, yeah, maybe I should be, but it depends on what I want to do there. And in the same sense, in some Indian context, it was simply highlighted to be reborn as a woman is highly disadvantageous because you don't have access to education at all. So that argument makes sense from a rebirth context. So that is highly misunderstood. The Buddha says all men and women can equally find enlightenment. But if you take into account rebirth and you are living in a highly patriarchal society, you might want to take at least a break in between where you just play man, and you get your education, you get on, and then when it needs to be, as the Venerable Tara here actually did, that is highlighted here somewhere. And one of the major tantric deities in Tibetan Buddhism is a female one. And she beautifully exemplifies this. At one point, she is according to the story, she's a princess and she's deeply impressed with Buddhism, wants to become liberated. And the monks tell her, like, then you should pray to become a man in your next life, and then you might get there. And she says, I don't think so. I take the vow that I will be reborn as a woman until the end, and I will manifest as a woman. And she's by far the most popular Buddha form in Tibet. So it was very fitting that Bhikkhuni Dhammananda had a beautiful image of Tara hanging above her head. I think, and because in the end, these Buddha forms we manifest through us. Yeah. So, good question.
Well, thank you, Venerable, and so
Thank you.
appreciate. Yeah, if you would like to buy a book or sign up for my mailing list, please come over to the table here. And I guess I'd like to end with something Venerable said to me. We were presenting in Bangkok at the Siam Society. At the end, she said, the reality of the importance of Cindy's book is that it gets the conversation going. So thank you for getting the conversation going tonight.
Something maybe to add to this is that one way to support her work is actually to support her nunnery. So you can directly help her in her endeavors by finding the nunnery on the website.
Yes, and now you used to have to give through her like a Swift code and a Thai bank account. It's all, you can do it.
Yeah.
It's not Venmo, but it's something, another one of those online giving platforms. I'm not sure what it is. Yeah, anyway, and her website is oh boy, I almost have to spell it. It's like the word song, Dhamma, Kalyani.com. And if anybody would like to do that, I'll spell it out for you. I'll show you how to get access to her website.
Or Google Bhikkhuni Dhammananda, and it turns up right by
The
itself.
website will come
That
up.
saves you over looking for long words. Maybe with a final word for Shantideva. For as long as space remains and for as long as sentient beings remain, maybe to remain to dispel the sufferings of this world. Thank you for writing this book. Please pass my greetings again to Kunila.
Thank you
Thank you.
all so much for coming.